Welcome to today's ESR panel discussion. Thanks for coming in person. It's a rare event that we are doing something in person, but here we are. On the other hand, we have at the moment 35 people out there on Zoom. So welcome everyone. My name is Thomas Neitzert. I'm your MC for today. And just in terms of introduction, I'm the current treasurer of ESR. I'm an emeritus professor of the other great university in town, AUT. And in terms of this event here, I worked for 8 years at Mercedes-Benz in Germany on cars, trucks, and buses. I hope that gives me a little bit of credibility to say something here. So without further ado, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the pizza for all the people that are here. Sorry for the people on the screens at home. And Mott McDonald just wants to say a few words as well. So please, Mott.
I won't be long. It's interesting. I was here, I graduated in 1991.
Who with?
You. And one of my lecturers was Roger Dunn. There he is. He's right there. Look, I just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to help sponsor this event. It's clearly in alignment with some of the thinking that Mott McDonald has. Mott McDonald is an organisation that I work for that I believe we deliver infrastructure to achieve community improvements and for great social outcomes. That's the way I look at it, even though I'm an engineer. So it's important that we have a philosophy around how we improve our environment. And this topic tonight is clearly in alignment with where we are going as an organisation. So we are really pleased to help support this event. Just to recognise the fact that we are carbon neutral as an organisation globally, and we are on a journey as well to achieve a net zero target. And there's lots and lots of challenges that go with that. So I'm looking forward to hear from the speakers and interesting discussion that I'm sure will be in the next half hour or so or an hour. So thank you very much for the acknowledgement, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, that whole thing, because of you, will most likely take an hour or even longer. But let's see how it works. What we try to achieve today is we try to put a few ideas out, but on the other hand, we like to hear from you what you think about different strategies to decarbonize transport. And we like to use that information for future submissions to the government, to the Ministry of Transport, and whoever wants to listen to Engineers for Social Responsibility. So this is just the start of something that we want to pursue over the next few months. We will have, after the introduction of the panel members, a bit of an introduction of the topic. And then we will have a few statements by the panel members and also a few questions for the panel members. And we will see how we then allow also your questions to fit into that. And then we have the 44 people out on Zoom at the moment, and they might want to say something as well. So let's see how this goes. I'd like to introduce our 3 panel members, and the 4th one is Helen Fitt in Christchurch, here on the screen. So first I'd like to introduce Ross Rutherford on the furthest to my right, to your left. Ross has a long and varied career in transport planning. He has an honors degree in civil engineering and a master's degree in transport planning and engineering. His work experience includes highway design and traffic engineering. He was group manager transport planning and then group manager rapid transit with the former Auckland City Council. We will not hold that against you, Ross. He had a leading role in changing the council's focus from roading to public transport and headed the council's investigation into a rapid transit system for the region based primarily on light rail. So, thank you, Ross. Then we have in Christchurch, Dr. Helen Fitt from Lincoln University. Helen is a postdoctoral fellow working in Lincoln University's Faculty of Environment, Society and Design. She is a social scientist interested in the influence that transport technologies have on social and cultural aspects of mobility and vice versa. Helen is interested in how we can better understand social complexity and make better decisions about our transport systems. Next is Irina Holleran. She is a PhD student of this fine university here. Irina is undertaking her PhD on benefit optimization of recycling of asphalt materials, porous asphalts, and has a passion for improving environmental practices in the transport construction sector. She has previously worked in a number of countries and as laboratory manager and researcher for Falcon & Hogan. And last but not least, our co-host here, Dr. Doug Wilson from ESR and also the Transport Research Center of the University of Auckland. Doug is a senior lecturer in transportation engineering and a founding member of the University of Auckland's Transportation Research Center. He has worked for central and local government and private consultancies. His research interests are in transportation infrastructure development, safety, materials, community well-being, and future transport technologies, including transport electrification and wireless charging systems for vehicles that can lead to a more equitable, sustainable, and desirable transport future. So these are our panel members, and I like to ask Doug now to set the scene. Just one other comment, I forgot, the people on Zoom are currently all muted, but if you want to raise any questions, then please use the chat functions and we try to pick up your questions from here. So over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Thomas. I want to start by firstly apologising that I've been struggling with a bit of a head cold. It's not COVID. But in the weekend, so I hope that my voice will last out after lecturing also in the afternoon and different discussions. But so thank you for everybody coming. We're looking forward to talking with you on these very important aspects of where we go in the future. I'm just going to set a little bit of the scene in terms of the total or quantifying what the problem is and some of the issues that we need to consider as a sector that is involved in producing carbon emissions. So what we're talking about in this is obviously from the Ministry of Environment, set from sort of the last data had been up to 2017. But what we're looking at is this slice of the pie here, which is related to transport, which is 19.7% of the total greenhouse gases. And what in 1990 that amount was in the order of a total greenhouse gases of 64 million tonnes. And that's the benchmark if we want to say that if we're trying to meet the global requirements is to get back to that point. And obviously a lot of things have happened since 1990. And what we want to discuss here today is that we're actually not doing very well at all as a sector, and we need to do much better. So what that carbon footprint now is in 2018 is 79 million tonnes. So that's an increase of gross gases of 24% as a country. But what we're considering is basically that differences to from 1990 to 2017. And what we're looking at is the proportion of that carbon footprint related to transport, which at that time in 1990 was about 8.2 million tonnes, being 12.7%. Unfortunately, our sector has done the worst in terms of increases. So since 1990, the transport sector has actually increased 90% of emissions during that period. And that now ends up being 20% of the total, 15.5 million megatons of greenhouse gases. So we've got a long way to go in terms of whether even stopping that trend. And obviously in the last few years, it started to slow, but to meet climate emission targets, we've got extremely long way to go to even get back to anything back down to what that is, which is the benchmark we're trying to get back to. I'm just going to shift that over at the moment. So in terms of those gases, 90% of those emissions is basically by road, 6.7% by domestic aviation, and then the sort of remaining proportions is the other transport sectors, rail and other measures for that. So 90% being by road, obviously that's the biggest target sector that we need to be considering. And here I'd like to basically just to see through the carbon life cycle of the vehicle side of things as an example of where we're trying to see that it's a systems approach. Now, New Zealand is quite different to other countries in terms of context. So we are very different in terms of energy options, also transport networks, being only 5 million people for approximately the size of Japan, a little bit less than Japan, being the Olympics being there at the moment. They're about 120 million, we're 5 million. And so critical mass has always been a difficult issue, which means as a country compared to other countries, we are seen as a relatively low traffic volume country. That means our solutions are going to be very different to other countries, given the types of development that we have in the country. But if you think about the total carbon that can be produced by the transport sector, looking through some of vehicles in here, the emissions that I just showed you in terms of the budget actually only includes the tailpipe emissions. So it doesn't actually include the embodied energy of the materials and the energy that's required to actually produce the vehicles. And so we're going to go through just, whoops, what's happening here? Sorry, I clicked on the wrong thing. So just, what have I clicked on here? I clicked on the image. It's always helpful to have good IT technicians. There we go. Thank you. So the other thing key here that is also important to understand is that an average in terms of OECD countries from 2018, per capita per person across the world is about 11.5 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per capita. In New Zealand, 2018, we have 16.6 tonnes per capita. So as a country, per capita, we are producing much more emissions than other people, and that's an important aspect that we need to consider going forward.
Is that just transport?
No, that's across the total. That includes agricultural. That's one of the reasons why. So agriculture obviously is almost 50% of our emissions. So what I'm going to do is sort of go through quickly some of these different stages. So if we think about the first stage being raw materials and manufacturing, then they obviously can be produced externally to the country or internally to the country, and that's an important aspect that we need to consider. So we're going to go through and discuss some of these things. So that could be the vehicles in terms of the manufacturing of the vehicles themselves, or it could be in terms of infrastructure, the materials to build the infrastructure. So if it's aggregates, for example, it's local, we take into account under the construction sector, those emissions, but it doesn't get accounted for in the transport emission side of things. But if it's a vehicle and it's manufactured overseas, then obviously that's imported to New Zealand, or if it's bitumen as a product, as a material, then if that's imported also from overseas, we don't have to account for those. So the picture is actually much worse than the 20% when you add in these other things that we have as a society that we're considering. So there's all sorts of aspects in terms of how we can do better in terms of perhaps looking at the importing, manufacturing aspects to be able to locally develop. So as was mentioned, most of the vehicles are imported. We don't really have a manufacturing of vehicles at all. We don't account for any of those emissions in terms of coming to New Zealand as a country. So consumer choice and behaviour are key things that we need to think about in terms of reducing down VKT, vehicle kilometres travelled, living, working and playing locally. These are some of the strategies that we'll talk about more in the decisions hopefully going forward. Shifting to more shared or active modes, demand management, congestion pricing, equitable transitions, and to our Māori approaches are important as well, given that they're a sector that can actually offer some good learnings for us as being able to live more locally and being more community-based. If we also think about the fuel, then obviously if we refine the fuel in New Zealand, currently that is, we are doing that, then that obviously is taken into account in our emissions. If it's imported, then obviously we are not taken into account as those. And that's one of the things with the Marsden Point at the moment, which is now planned to be closed. We're going to be, there's almost a driver to actually import from overseas, because then we don't have to account for the emissions from that. And that's an obscene view of our total emissions, if we're thinking as a country or worldwide, that we're considering, just pass the buck to somebody else. And so we need to be careful about some of our policies that we're considering. Might just delete that down to a smaller size. So then if we think about the, so I've done it again. The tailpipe emissions, and obviously that is emissions that are fully accounted for in the New Zealand situation that we need to be considering. And then there is a final part, so policy incentives and disincentives for, you'll see some subsidies and disincentives for our vehicle fleets coming out from government, and also consideration of energy for transportation electrification. So as increases, we change our fleet to be more electric, we're going to need more power. So if that is clean energy, that's good. But if it's dirty energy, and we're importing now coal from Indonesia, which is madness, in terms of it's even dirtier than New Zealand coal. And so some of these decisions that drive poor behaviour as a country are key things that we need to consider. And then there's the race for new minerals, which is no longer maybe oil, but basically nickel, cobalt, and lithium to be able to produce the batteries, etc., to import into the country, etc. So there's some big issues that we need to consider. Reducing emissions for the vehicle fleet. As the abstract talked about, avoiding, shifting, or improving the vehicle fleet. Shifting to more active micro-mobility, travel, cycle and walking. Key issues that we need to consider to be able to reduce that effect. Then the last phase of that is then reuse and recycling. And as a country, we again, from a waste minimisation side of things, if you take the 5 R's principles in terms of reducing, reusing, recycling, recover, and then residual management of that being the last sort of effect of that, we're not very good really at dealing with our own waste. And one of our solutions in the past is just to export it overseas for somebody else to deal with. Again, we should be as a country dealing with the issues that we create and managing them within the economy that we have. So providing the right incentives for all of those aspects are really important, understanding the circular economy. And we'll be talking in the session about research and capability building for that. So that's sort of the 5 stages of the carbon life cycle. So that's for the vehicle manufacturer and the life cycle for that. What we also need to think about is the life cycle of infrastructure. And there's a similar sort of scale there in terms of the raw materials, the use of that, the operations, the maintenance and construction through that life cycle as well. But we used the vehicle there as being the main things. So with that, I'll pass over to Ross to introduce, to Thomas, to talk about public transport and mass transit.
Okay, hello. I'm not going to talk to this slide. I think what I've tried to do is summarise what's needed to make public transport work. I missed out parking policy on that, but adding that in, we've got best I can on one piece of paper. What I thought I would very quickly do is to discuss or just summarise what some other cities have done. Every city is different, and everyone has their own unique solutions, including Auckland will have ours. But I'll just go through some out of interest. One of them was Portland in Oregon. It decided it had a very congested, polluted city centre not long during the time when they were building motorways and Los Angeles was developing its freeway system. So they decided there had to be a better way. So what they did around 40 years ago was decided to put a focus this future on what they decided was light rail. Supported by medium high density development around stations. And that was the critical part of it, not just the technology, but developing around stations. with medium high density development, mixed use type development. That has worked very well. What they've done is they had a lot of public consultation beforehand. They made sure the public agreed that this is the way they wanted to go. And as a result, they've had support, political support all that time, whether it's a Democrat or it's a Republican in charge, it didn't matter. They still stuck with it. And I think that to me is a very important message. Get yourself a strategy and stick with it. Don't keep changing it over time. The second one might be Vancouver in Canada, British Columbia. It has developed a system around the SkyTrain, which is a viaduct-based system with a fully automated rail. And again, they have developed high density around their stations. What they did is they incentivized the private sector to provide high density at various stations. Also, the public sector owns some land, and that is also a great help. The system, the SkyTrain, runs on viaduct until right in the middle of the city, then it goes underground in the last short distance. But Vancouver has also got trolleys, it's got buses, it's got ferries and all sorts of things. It's a very good example. And high-rise, it's very high-rise in the city centre, quite dense. A good example of what you can achieve, again, by having a long-term strategy and sticking to it. A third example is maybe at Curitiba in Brazil. Most of you might well have heard of that, but Curitiba, it was in this Piranha state, and it had a plan developed by a French engineer, I think it was, to have these large boulevards into the city centre. And the plan at that time in Brazil was that we build motorways. But the mayor of Curitiba decided, no, we'll do a different thing, we'll build busway. So they built busways along these rail corridors leading into the city centre. They developed major stations along those bus routes in which feeder buses feed it in, form a sort of a circular system with spokes into the centre and then the services around in the spoke system. So you got suburb to suburb service as well as service into the city centre. So again, they had a long-term strategy. Again, they've stuck with it. They picked a technology they knew as buses and was affordable. They're not wealthy, and they were able to maintain buses. The private sector runs the buses, but the public sector controls the system. Another example, a little bit different, is Copenhagen in Denmark. There they had a traffic engineer decided over many years he would gradually get rid of the parking in the city centre. Bit by bit, he got rid of parking, and then once the parking was removed, they could then create parks, they could create open space, space where the people could congregate, where they could sit, they go to cafes and so on. Totally revitalized the centre of Copenhagen. And at the same time, they developed a network of cycleways right through the city, which is relatively flat. And now you can cycle from one place right along to the destination on separate cycleways along the whole route. Now, we're just starting that process in Auckland, but once you can get a route to cycleways safe the whole length, you can really start building up your cycle numbers. And I think the final one was London. London, I'll give an example, because it used congestion pricing. The centre of London is very well served by public transport. I think something like 80% of people come there by public transport, but it was very congested. So they wanted to create a more pleasant city centre, so they introduced congestion pricing. And what that did is it reduced the amount of traffic in the city centre, got rid of the congestion. At the same time, it created space. And the space on these roads they could then use to create cycleways, to create better conditions for pedestrians, to create a more livable centre. And that's, to me, is an important message. If you can get the cars away, you create space, and you can then use that space more to make your city the kind of place people want to be. The cities that work are cities we walk in. We walk in the centre of a city, that's where we want to be. We're going to enjoy being there. Okay, and I think that was all I wanted to say. Is that 3 minutes? So there you are, best of luck. But I think, as I main last message, everyone has developed their own strategy, but we need to develop a strategy in Auckland and stick to it, no matter what. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ross. So I try to hand over the control now to Helen in Christchurch. Helen, can you say something?
Yep, can you hear me?
We hear you, yeah.
Can you hear me? Excellent. There we go. And it appears I also have control. Fantastic, thank you. Kia ora koutou. Social science, alongside other disciplines, of course, is going to be critical, I think, to decarbonising our transport systems, because we're going to need to change what people actually do. And that's quite a complex undertaking. So to start my contribution today, then I want to talk very briefly about the difference between behaviour change and practice change, because I think that understanding this distinction can help us to work more effectively. I'm going to have to simplify for brevity here, but broadly speaking, behaviour change is usually understood as being about getting people to change what they do, and it often goes a little bit like this. People are doing something that we don't want them to do, like, for example, driving a car. So we try to change what they're doing, often by educating them or by encouraging them or by incentivizing them to do something different, such as riding a bike. So essentially here, what we're doing is we're acting on a person to try to get them to change. Now, the advantage of this approach is that it's conceptually very simple. It's very easy to understand. The disadvantages of this approach are that it's often ineffective. People often don't do what we want them to do. And this kind of approach is sometimes resisted because people, again, they don't particularly like being told what they should do. Practice change, by contrast, it doesn't seek to change people. It seeks to change the context that they live in, which then later on has an effect in terms of changing what people do. It's quite a subtle difference, but let me try to explain the difference a bit more. Now, we're all influenced by all sorts of things all the time, some of which we're probably not even aware of. There are lots of influences on our behavior that often as individuals we don't even recognize. So if you drive a car, you're probably influenced by the technology that's available to you and infrastructure and social norms and costs and way more things that I would ever have had the space to fit on this slide. So we all live in these messy and interconnected webs of influences on our behavior. And trying to change what we do while all of this, or most of it even, stays the same is actually quite unlikely to work. So what practice change argues is rather than focusing on trying to change the person's behavior, you focus on trying to change the context around them. So if the result of the current context that we've got, as in this diagram, is driving, and we shift the context, so we change infrastructure and we change technology and we change urban form and so on. Obviously, we're unlike the simplification in the diagram, we're not going to change them all uniformly and at the same time. But if we change all of those things, then we have a chance of getting a different result. Now, the downside of practice theory is that it's conceptually quite complex. And if you haven't entirely followed or grasped the argument in this 2-minute description, you wouldn't be alone. This is something that is actually quite difficult to grasp the difference here. But the upsides of this strategy is that it stands more chance of being effective than a behavior change strategy. And when it's done well, it's actually less often resisted because we're not trying to change people, we're just changing the things around them. So if you're sitting here thinking, I really need to understand this to achieve what I want to achieve, then just let me know and I'm very happy to explain it more thoroughly on some other occasion when we've got a bit more time. For now, I want to finish by saying that what you call something, whether you call it behavior change or practice change, it really doesn't matter. And I sometimes think that when people talk about behavior change, what they're actually talking about is practice change. That is, they're working on the context and not on the people, which is great. But I think the underlying principle remains the same here. So today, from a social science perspective, I would encourage you just to think, don't try to change the people, because that's really, really hard. Try to change the context that they live in. And I will leave it there for now and look forward to some questions shortly. Thank you.
Okay, we are back in business here. And I'd like to hand over to Irina to make her initial statement.
How do I get the whole thing? Yeah. Cheers, thanks. One of the ways to reduce carbon emissions and the carbon footprint is, of course, reuse and recycle. But instead of focusing on percentage of recycled materials we put in new materials, we really should be focusing on performance. And this means using performance-based specifications, not empirical type approaches, and also educating clients and authorities that recycled materials actually can perform as well or sometimes even better than virgin materials. We should not be wasting our recycled materials into low value applications. I will give you an example using porous asphalt millings, which is porous asphalt high value material, into low value applications like putting on top of unsealed roads or using it like on top of membranes. So by doing this, you're wasting it. And this is what I'm currently doing, research here. I'm taking porous asphalt millings, high value application, and working out how I can put it back into high value application, such as new porous asphalt, with aids like rejuvenation agents, which restore some of properties of old binders in porous asphalt. One of the things is we do not use enough is in use of institute type recycling. This includes cold and hot in place recycling, full depth rehabilitation, various type of stabilization techniques using cement, fly ash, formed bitumen and lime. We also really in other countries they use it a lot. We are quite behind in this area using warm mix asphalt. Just give you an example. 1/3 of all asphalt produced in the US is warm asphalt, warm mix asphalt. Here there is hardly any. Another example, in Europe in some countries, cutback is banned because there is a lot of emissions. It's a real safety concern for people. We're still using it instead of using more safer ways of doing it, for example, bitumen emulsions. Use of locally viable materials really should be optimized, maximized. Example, crumb rubber. We heard different stories about other countries. I can tell you a story from Qatar. We worked in Qatar for 1.5 years on an infrastructure project for Soccer World Cup. And when we started to introduce crumb rubber in this country, no one wanted it. Contractors did not want to hear that because they were all set up to use polymer modifying binders. Slowly, with the help of EMEA, contractors had to change their view on that. And now almost no polymer modifying binder is used. It's all crumb rubber. And all these stockpiles of a lot of tires in Qatar are now in use. Another thing is plastic. There is a lot of plastic generated here, and we are not optimizing the use of that. There is different recycled aggregates. We started to use some aggregates from REP that it started to be taking over, but also we have chip seals. We also have demolition waste, not often used here. Glass, reclaimed asphalt pavement, the contractors actually started to use it quite a lot, but still we can maximize it. In Japan, Doug mentions the size of Japan. In Japan, very high volume of recycled asphalt going back to recycled asphalt because of a whole approach to that is about sustainability. And so we really need to improve in that. Even used toners can be used in our pavements, or even crushed toilet bowls. About straw, it was done in the US. So we really need to look into various waste streams which can be utilized in our pavements. But it's important not to use our pavement as a linear landfill. It is about performance.
Thank you, Irina. I'd like to hand back to Doug now, and he wants to introduce a project in south of Auckland, which we might refer to in a discussion as an example how things can be done better and see what kind of problems they are striking there. So, Doug, all over to you.
Thank you, Thomas. So I think sort of as a summary there, I mean, the transport system is already a very complex system. And there are many, many different aspects that we can be considering. So the idea of tonight is actually saying that it's not just one solution that's going to provide the answers. But I quite like this from John Keynes in the sense that often we get captured into old ways of doing things. And the easiest way to continue to do consulting, engineering, construction is to do the same old solutions that worked last week or last year or the last decade. And so, you know, I think what we're trying to do tonight is to actually suggest that we need to do things differently, and to expect, Albert Einstein sort of saying as well, if something doesn't work and you keep on trying to use it in the same method, it's pure madness to consider that you're going to get a different outcome. A sort of paraphrased version of Albert Einstein. But so, I mean, I think understanding that is a very important part. So I'd like to sort of suggest that this is just a case study in terms of housing development. So you've seen the different areas of things that we need to do right across the spectrum in terms of the embodied energy, to the way we import our goods. It's not just vehicles, but all of our goods. If we can be more locally sourced and more locally producing things, we're going to be always better. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Charles Marr, who's here today. And Charles, come up the front. So Charles, you might have seen in a few different media events, and he's the developer on the Holleran, which is in South Auckland. And I'll just ask Charles to sort of give a bit of a brief on that. But Charles has a real vision to do something differently. And it's also interesting that from my experience as well, is that the easiest thing to get things through development or through the agencies is to do the same as what everybody else is doing. And so all of our consenting and our guidelines and specifications and everything is trying to fit people into an envelope that sometimes shuts down innovation and thinking. And so we need to be always challenging what we're doing, and also the agencies that actually put these guidelines and specifications, because there are better ways to do things sometimes, and we need to learn. Given the climate change emergency that we have declared in New Zealand now, we do have to do things significantly differently, yet we're still building infrastructure and communities that are going to last 50 to 100 years in advance, that's going to lock in all of that embodied carbon that we're producing at the moment if we don't do something differently. So it's critical that we start to do it differently yesterday, let alone today. And so with that, Charles, please just tell everybody a little bit about what you're doing, what your vision for Oranga is, and just a little bit of the background.
All right. Well, I want to start first by saying that I did very much enjoy my time at the University of Auckland Engineering School, but I will start the story with another university, if that's okay. So my good professor at Stanford University said to me, Jeff Pfeffer said to me once, I said, Jeff, what do you think about people coming through the MBA classes and in Stanford and Silicon Valley? And he said to me, Charles, in your generation, most people are unwilling to take on the hard tasks. They want the low-hanging fruit. Most people that come to Silicon Valley, they're here to gold mine and they'll leave within the next 5 years. We are those, I asked, shouldn't Stanford be one of those schools that actually breed out world changes? And he said, no, it's a gold mine where people just leave and come and leave because this is a place where they can make it. They want to be next Steve Jobs, pretty much. So really what got me thinking at that point was that Jeff said, Charles, if only you would spend your life on working on something that's actually hard to achieve. And that reminded me of something that I said to the iwi when I first started Oranga. The iwi asked me about sustainability. And I said, to be honest, when I was in engineering school, what I learned about sustainability was profit, planet, and people. And then on top of that, you have culture. So those four kind of pillars here and there. And I said to the iwi, look, out of the four, the thing that actually is most dominant is culture. And then underneath that is people. And then profit and planet actually works when you get that order right. The most hardest thing as an engineer, I remember when I was in engineering school, was that you actually can't, we have made the fundamental assumption that you cannot change human beings. Their behaviors are fixed, and therefore we must design for that as a default norm. And because we've figured that the human being is too complex and they got emotions and they've got weird things that we can't quantify. And so from my point of view, I said to the iwi, I actually think people can change. And I'm going to take on a task of building a city that actually enables a new way of living, that people will want to do that. And I wasn't quite sure exactly what I got myself into at that time. That was around 7 years ago. I started off with housing, then as soon as I realized you can't really create meaningful culture with just 50 houses, 100 houses. You actually need thousands of houses, because you need thousands of houses to create a village center, which creates a sense of culture. You need thousands of houses, a few hundred houses to create primary schools, secondary schools, retirement village, town center, rail station, recreational parks, and health centers. All of those things affect how we live, a bit like what we're talking about in terms of practice change. I have embarked on a journey of a network approach towards shaping what our new communities will look like. I was reading a lot about Richard Sennett in terms of how he saw cities. I did a lot of, I have to say, I think I went through my own little MBA around the world for like the last 7 years, learning about how cities are formed. And to my surprise, it was designed, most cities around the world, including Paris that we love and all the other things. I traveled to 20 different countries, 40 different cities to 50. And I learned that most of them were designed on the basis of trying to control it's a military mindset behind designing cities. Pretty much the city is designed that how long does it take for me to shut the city down if there's a COVID crisis or if there's a military riot in terms of local unrest. And so the whole boulevard that you see that's wide in Paris, that was designed for tanks. Okay, because they learned previously from Europe that there's two small laneways. You can't put the machinery there to actually control the crowd. I think the mentality behind our cities just have to change. We can't be thinking about, and also, by the way, that's the reason why China can shut down a city within a day. Break down 3 bridges, you're locked in. I can shut you down. You can't even leave. You'll die here, and there's nothing you can do about it because I've disconnected you from, and it's deliberately designed that way. We must design our cities where we actually give dignity back to the human being and actually treat people as people of great value. And so I got that on the basis of my faith, my Christian faith. I see human beings has eternal value. And so I need to design it in that way. And so Oranga is the beginning of that. Right now, we're on the basis of really creating micro-mobilities, electric scooter, electric bikes. We have cycle lanes dedicated. We have autonomous vehicles working with NZTA right now. We have bus networks, and we're looking at the rail station, the exact location to be determined. All of that day one, ideally. No one does that. It costs you millions of dollars to bring a bus network to the middle of nowhere at the start. It costs you a huge amount of money to build that much. You talk about the laneways, about the width of the road. Well, our main road is 29 meters wide because you actually need that width to create a sense of corridor that enables dedicated cycle lanes and actually visual delight. I had a community forum around a month ago with the community that's around the first 100 families that moved in. And I said to them, the first thing they also stood in front of me and says, Charles, we want more car parks, because we have 3 cars and we wanted this and that. And, it's very uncomfortable to be in a room like that. But it was a reminder to me that people do change, because what happened, they started off the mentality. After I went through the kind of thinking behind why we designed the way that we have, I said, look, if I was to put more car parks to you, which I can, you will lose that beautiful strip of rain gardens as well as trees. And guess what? You're going to walk and see more metal and gray than you won't even want to walk here anymore. And so what I've done deliberately at the start was I actually designed a beautiful place. And I realized when you create a beautiful place, the mothers that complain about, I want more car parks because my kid needs to be right in front of my house when I get out of my car, they thought, well, yes, that's convenient and helpful, but I wouldn't trade it for the dedicated walkways and the waterways that I can get to and the parks I can get access to my kid to school. Compare that with just the slight convenience of having my car right in front of my doorstep. They've decided that actually we're content. We're content with beauty. My challenge at the end of that forum, one of the only questions I want to pose in the heads of these residents was that think twice before you buy the next car, because you realize you're wasting a lot of money living in Auckland and try to work off cars. Now, don't get me wrong. One of the hardest things, and I think Doug is wrestling with it just as I am, and practicality is when you create a new community from scratch, you just don't have the amenities up front to enable to sustain them staying there. They have to leave for the early stages just to work somewhere else, whatever, and to shop somewhere else. How do we do that and transition well is my task now. I've started well with the first fruit of people willing to say, Charles, I'm actually willing. The first 100 families says, I'm willing to commit to 1 car per house. That is a miracle for a greenfield. No one says that. Everybody complains, okay? And I also found that the family said, look, I love the street so much now that I actually won't want to see it to turn into car parks, even though it gives me a bit more convenience. And by the way, because it's done so well, it's becoming a regional destination where all these cars are queuing up that we can never outbuild them. I remember Mission Bay or Hobsonville, even if you put the maximum amount of car parks, it's still not enough, because if you create a beautiful place, people will just come anyways. So the strategy must be public transport. They gotta get in here differently, not through cars only. And so Auckland really is a real life case of some of these things that we think is impossible coming to life.
Thank you, Charles. I think we had a few slides and pictures of what Oranga was doing, and we might come back to some of these things, but I'll pass it back to Thomas. No, you speak.
Yeah, these were the initial statements of our panel members. I now like to put a few questions to them. The first one is, we realize we have to use less fossil fuel. We are all in agreement on that. We are also currently using around 1.6 Earths per year, but we only got 1. Is manufacturing more cars, including electric vehicles, the right strategy to reduce emissions and to avoid resource depletion? Is anyone game enough to have an opinion on that? Irina?
I can just, sorry. I can just, even from the environmental point, can comment atmospheric deposition of waste coming from vehicles. It's not going away. In fact, if you introduce electric vehicles, maybe more people want to buy it. So all these heavy metals coming, zinc, copper, and things like that, they will accumulate in the pavement as well as alongside of the pavement, and that through atmospheric deposition, it can be picked up and distributed further. So in my point of view, it will not change that part. It would not reduce the waste, the heavy metals, which are coming from vehicles.
I think the conundrum that we have is that it's a very complex system that we actually have created over, obviously, the last 150 years in New Zealand development. To change that overnight is practically impossible because we will have winners and losers. And one of the concerns that I have is that if we provide great incentives to change, we are often helping those that can afford that change. And the expense is at the people that can't afford it. And so it is a real difficult situation that we have, but we have to think quite differently and provide the structure and the support for those that do need to change, perhaps not necessarily the communities that they live in, but the way they actually can get employment. And I think one of the COVID has been a really good example, I think, in the last year, where the government likes to say that actually where the economy is doing pretty well again, we haven't got that much people that have lost their jobs, but because the net difference looks pretty good. But the problems is they're not taking into account that those that have lost their jobs and who they are in society, and that there is more and more difficulty for those that haven't had the same opportunities as you and I in this room to be able to develop the skills to be able to transfer to different types of jobs. And so they might be traveling around the city to 2 or 3 different jobs, being very low paid, that don't have any other opportunity other than having a very high emitting vehicle that is 15 to 20 years old. And remember that New Zealand has got a very old vehicle fleet. We've got it 14 plus years and getting older, not younger. And so by providing incentives to those that can afford to be able to have reductions that they can actually, but we're not going to see any trickle down of those vehicles for some time, those benefits are not going to come to those that actually really require help now as well. So it is difficult, but I do think that when we're talking about public transport and investment and cycleways and active modes in terms of reducing VKT, shifting VKT to more shared modes, we need to be making bold decisions because they last 50 plus years. And I don't think we've been anywhere near bold enough in terms of the solutions that we're providing, given that we are reinventing the same thing that we did in previous generations. So that's a challenge that I think is that we need to be much bolder from leadership. Leadership has to lead this. That's you and I in the room as well. We need to make much better change together and actually take ownership to be able to actually challenge those in the agencies and the ministries as well to do things better. And that's where we're hoping to do some work with Charles in that area about making some change structurally to see those benefits change over the communities. Because we're building houses like crazy, but we're still doing the same thing as we were before and creating more problems in some areas.
Okay, there's a question here in the audience.
Yes, I was just wondering, to me it seems that you're spot on. I think my voice is big enough. Oh, for the yes. Yes, so I think you're spot on in saying that public transport is where we need to invest, particularly in Auckland. And what I've lost my train of thought now. I'm so sorry. I was going to ask, oh yes, the roadblock for developing that public transport, those solutions in Auckland, for example, our rail link and things like that. It seems to me that some of that is around the capacity we have in the construction sector and the engineering expertise, that sort of thing. Would you say that was a problem we need to solve, or do you think we do have that capacity? It's just being poorly utilised at the moment in other projects.
Ross, that is a question for you. Yes.
I mean, maybe we're just using it on local roads and things.
Have you got the capacity in the system to do it all? For example, in Penmure, they are slowing that three-lane bridge down at the moment because they are running out of money to finish it off. It's a disgrace.
Okay, I'm not. In my view, we're not very good at making the best use of what we have, and I think we've got plenty of engineering expertise in New Zealand, but we're maybe not using it the way we should be. And I think if we focused on what we should be doing and not keep on doing exactly what we used to be doing, I think we'll be fine. But we need to change our direction and focus our energies in the right place. That, in my view, is what we need to do.
Yeah, it looks like the money is allocated, but we are not getting off the ground in Auckland. For example, with the light rail project, it has been announced by the Labour government 4 years ago, and now we're having another consultation on it. When do we ever get anything done in this city is the question. Okay, one more from the audience.
Yeah, I was very interested in your example from the city of South America about travel services, speeding services, and suburb to suburb services. I live on the outer suburbs. I live up in Titirangi, which has long suffered from a need for that. And I've suggested it to local members of parliament and to Auckland Council members in the past. Do you know if anyone is actively doing any work on that option that you've suggested?
Ross is answering that one.
I think one that Auckland's got too much focus on the city centre. We've got all of our public transport, most of it focusing at one point. And the recent changes, thanks to COVID and so on, they're reducing the importance of the city centre, causing more of a diverse kind of city. And I think we need a public transport system which recognises that, which allows people, say, who live out in West Auckland, who want to work in South Auckland, to be able to travel by public transport, not into the city centre. And I think that's where we tend to be needed to focus.
Well, Thomas is making a comment there. I'll just add as well, is that I think, and this is just a personal opinion, but I also think that because of the focus, remember that we have had 3 or 4 decades of underinvestment in transport that we're trying to catch up on. And so for many decades, we were collecting taxes in transport and never ever spending it in the transport sector. And so we've now got this double-edged sword where we are trying to build as quickly as possible. We're behind, we're already in congested networks where the CBD is busy. So anything you do is going to disrupt a lot of different things. It's costing us more because of those issues, and we're getting less and less for the money that we're actually investing in those areas. And so I tend to agree that, you know, if you go back to the 1970s, 70% of the workforce was working in the CBD. It's now 30% work in the CBD and 70% are working outside of that region. And so, and yet most of our public transport and all the big infrastructure projects are focused on the city centre. And as Charles has mentioned, it's very, very difficult to get the investment in the outer parts of the Auckland region because of these big projects that are required and spending more and more of the money that we have available. We are spending more than we've ever spent before in transport, and every year it's building, but we're building less for it because of the big ticket items that we're spending that on because we didn't do it 30 years ago. And so that is a key issue that we need to resolve as well, is that it needs additional investment. And if we're going to lead by example and build those transit-oriented developments and the things from the outside to get those working well with the communities that have been built, then we have to invest in those areas first before we actually build the houses in some ways. That's very difficult on today's basis.
Hi, I just wanted to say that like investing more as a taxpayer, ratepayer, etc. No, more money. Why not use the recycled stuff? Why not make it cheaper? We've got a landfill about to be built in Dome Valley potentially, which a lot of people don't want. And a lot of it's construction waste. And so back to recycle, let's use it. Let's make it cheaper. Let's talk like that. That's what I think. Thanks. Is it possible?
Can I comment on that? The problem is recycled materials is often not cheaper. That's the difficulty, is that you're actually additional processing. And so it actually costs more to use recycled materials than virgin materials. And that's one of the biggest problems we have. So that's why we import materials overseas. We import Indonesian coal because it's cheaper than for us to produce it in New Zealand, because it's an expedient answer rather than actually doing it for the right reason. So
but we're not paying the penalties for the carbon.
exactly.
and the environment.
So we should account for it properly, and we should actually, I think that's fundamental. Is we need to have integrity as a nation to what we're producing and what we're actually dealing with. We don't.
So perhaps I can give a very amateur view. These are all pretty experts, PhD here, so I'm just a pretty average guy giving a pretty average view. But one of the things I've found in the last 7 to 8 years is that because when you're investing in yourself personally, you really got to test what's for real and what's kind of good theory, but actually never going to work. This is one of the things I found out, which might be of interest. I think the essence of what we're trying to achieve is minimize waste, because wastage is not just in material, but wastage in time, wastage in human capital, wastage in actually land value as well. I remember I was once asked, Charles, what do you think about affordable housing? And I remember I was interviewed on this, and I said to them, I don't think we have an affordable housing crisis, because you can actually build a house somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It's going to be pretty cheap. There's plenty of land actually in New Zealand. It's just there isn't plenty of land close to job centers that you actually will spend time in. And try to figure out the most successful cities in the world. They are the most priciest. They're either with the best schools or they're in some sort of serious job center. Gentrification is about the wealthy getting closer to energy and the poor getting spread out in the middle of nowhere. So we don't have an affordable housing crisis. We have quality jobs crisis, where we don't create enough of that. And we end up centralizing in one place, and we keep building on that one place because we're hedging all our bets on that place. And so I said to them, what if we just created better places and more job centers? And to do that well, that's when transport becomes critical, because employees don't put their businesses in the middle of nowhere. They put it in where there's movement economy. They put it in where there's close to serious infrastructure that can enable friction to take place, that enables retail to come alive, that enables job centers, the trade and logistics to take place. And that's why I think a lot of our transport has been focused about how to move the car around rather than how do you actually create maximum value for the land, and therefore maximizing the kind of options for people. Right now, New Zealand's one of the few places around the world that we're kind of hedging our bets on Auckland, maybe Wellington. Christchurch is working on it. That's about it. Everywhere else is lost, and I'm going to try to work with Hamilton, but that's about. And so we're monopolized in terms of the job centers. We only have 2, or maximum 3. Most cities around, most successful places around the world, they have multiple places. I mean, look at Europe, and they have pockets of job centers everywhere, and they are interconnected by those what do you call them, regional kind of connectivities. So my view will be minimize wastage. My personal view, we have to look at it holistically and say, okay, what is actually on the table here, and what have we just, assumed that is not something that we're going to realize. The opportunity cost is greater than just the cost of materials.
Yeah, I'll still will add. Yes, it is possible to save if you use recycled materials. It depends on recycled materials. So, for example, if you're using reclaimed asphalt pavement, which is we call RAP in our industry, at relatively high percentages in new asphalt, you can save quite a good money in the price of asphalt mix. Yes, it needs to be processed by companies, but it's still very saving there. Also, in relation to improving properties of materials with use of modifiers instead of bringing it polymers from, say, Singapore, the US, and places like that, we can utilize polymers such as a crumb rubber or plastic pellets, LDPE, HDPE, and things like that. And that can reduce cost. But again, it's highly depends on the material. Some materials require more cost to produce. Yeah.
Let's change the subject a little bit. The government is currently putting out this fee-based system where electric cars are being subsidized and double cab utes are being penalized. So that's called demand management, which can be done by a fee-based system and can also be done by taxes or by the emissions trading system. But how can that be done in a just way? At the moment, the farmers are complaining for whatever reason, but there might be other groups in society that are disadvantaged by such themes and by any tax systems that are being introduced to reduce fossil fuel demand. How can that be done in a just way? Are there any ideas? That might be a question for Helen.
Yeah, I think Helen should start first.
Yes, thank you. I think I'll start perhaps by coming back to some of the things some of the points that were raised when we were talking about whether manufacturing more cars is the answer. I mean, I think clearly the answer to that question itself is no, but it is a slightly more nuanced answer than that. And I think some very good things, some very relevant things were said about that. For example, Doug was talking about the equity of a shift to EVs, and that's clearly very important. There's also the issue that Irina mentioned. There is increasing evidence to suggest that when people have EVs, they travel more. There are a couple of reasons for that. The cost of each trip gets cheaper. The environmental guilt of driving disappears. So anybody who was driving less for environmental reasons, actually when they have an EV, even though I would argue that EVs aren't environmentally neutral, a lot of that guilt disappears, so people drive more. And EVs are also arguably more fun to drive than combustion cars, so driving rates increase. So all that means that if we produce more cars, even if they're EVs, we're likely to get more traffic. If we get more traffic, we have more of those local pollutants, more of the issues associated with paving valuable land. We have all the equity issues. We even have things like higher accident rates. And we know that the people who come off worst from vehicle accidents are people in more disadvantaged groups. So all of these things mean that if we have more cars, even if they're EVs, we actually have some substantial equity issues. How do we deal with it? I think the upfront thing, first of all, is acknowledging that everything we do has an equity implication. There's a 2017 cabinet paper that under equity issues for gender and for disabilities, when talking about the promotion of EVs, says there are no equity dimensions of this to report. Now, I think that's probably short-sighted, and we could talk about those equity implications in a lot more detail. So I think the first thing is we need a real acknowledgement that what we do does have equity dimensions. And then we need to work out how to address those equity dimensions from a range of different perspectives. And I think often if we design our transport systems in the ways that we've been talking about today, putting people close to where the jobs are, where the shops are, having places that are accessible in different ways, building our cities with people in mind, once we start doing all of these things, the equity implications start to lessen. So with a specific focus on equity alongside some of the other things we've been talking about today, I think it is dealable with, but we have to actually, as Doug said earlier, take some bold action and do it.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd like to say there is obviously the emissions from an electric vehicle is still much better than a combustion engine. And so obviously for essential travel that is required, it is a good idea for us to electrify that fleet. And remember that the heavy vehicle fleet, which is only 6% of the actual vehicle fleet, produces 24% of the emissions in the transport sector. And so that's not just the light vehicle fleet. We also need to address the heavy vehicle fleet. And that may mean that we need to actually have transition fuels that actually, because we may be not quite ready yet to electrify a heavy vehicle fleet, but using biofuels, for example, is still better than using full diesel emissions. And so we need to think about all strategies, and it's not going to be, again, as I mentioned before, one solution that is going to answer this. We have to do on all fronts to actually look at how we can do things better and to actually develop these areas. And that's the key thing that we tend to get focused, all of us, in terms of things we do in those decisions, but everything is actually needing to be addressed.
I could come back and add a little more to that if that's okay, and just say that I think one of the key issues that there's an argument that we shouldn't try to shift the fleet to EVs because what we do with that is we sort of absolve ourselves from responsibility from doing bigger things. And I think there is some validity in that argument, but there is also some validity in the argument that we need to shift that fleet for the easy wins that it provides. So I think we need to take account of both of those arguments and actually shift the fleet while doing other things as well.
There was a question here in the audience.
Now, in 1991, our car was actually not as efficient and environmental friendly as today. But we have increased 90% in our carbon footprint. So it's just mainly because we have more cars. And I've been living in a few OECD cities already and visited quite a few others. And what is intriguing, what is surprised me is that here in Auckland, it seems that public transport seems to be way more expensive than private cars when I choose, travel. Like I live in the west of Auckland, and for me to travel to work by the ferry takes me $14.4 per day. But I can park my car close to work for $10 and have my flexibility. I have the compatibility of my car, and it's just. And also, when I was in Australia, petrol cost $600 to $800, $800 something here. When I was in the UK, insurance was like £1,000, so $2,000. It's $300 here. It's just because we're charging too less for car ownership and car uses. Should we charge that more and just use that money to subsidize public transport? It would be a simple solution.
Just to say, I agree, public transport is expensive, and part of the reason is that, New Zealand, we have this, I think called fare box policy, and the NZTA tries to get about 50-50 proportion of subsidy and fare box revenue. And it's an arbitrary number. And there's no reason why that has to be so, but that's the way the policy tends to go. So essentially, the people who are funding the public transport are driving the fares to some extent. And other cities in the world, they might see public transport as being more part of their social system. It's part of the way the city runs, of good public transport. So they fund it for that reason. But here we're stuck in with cost benefit type approach. And I think that's part of a lot of the problem.
One from Peter, and then I think we have to wind it up at some stage.
Yes, is it working? Yes. The IPC said that in terms of New Zealand dollars in their 2018 report that the damage cost is from carbon emissions is $140 a tonne, and there's more recent papers come out saying it's that, I put that in New Zealand dollars. It's more recent ones coming out saying $400 a tonne, which is about 500 New Zealand dollars. And James Hansen, the climate scientist who came here several years ago, he suggested that we should be charging this kind of amount, but then we should be taking all the money and giving it back to the population. So your petrol goes up in price quite a bit, but you also get a dividend back from the carbon charges, so you can decide whether to use it on petrol or whether to use it on something else. So I don't know whether you guys have got any views on this sort of thing.
So I come from an Asian background, so I'm very familiar with the likes of Singapore, China, and how they deal with Hong Kong, how they deal with congestions in a seriously dense city. yes, they do exactly that. They penalize people with cars, taxis, all sorts of things. And I see Auckland, I can't say New Zealand, but Auckland is going through a similar trajectory to where Sydney and Vancouver had gone through in the last 10 years, where, when COVID might have changed that a little bit, but in reality, Vancouver grew by 1 million people in the last 10 years. Sydney probably very similar. That many people, it doesn't matter how efficient your car is, just like you need to house them, they just take space, and you got to find a way to make sure that it's more than just 1 + 1 = 2 answers. It's actually, or 1 - 1 = 0. It's more, we have to find a way that it can actually fundamentally be a divider, a fraction of what it takes in terms of space. So I think first, we will probably naturally get into a higher tax situation where because every other country did around the world, they ended up doing that, which is the subsidies mindset. But they also needed to build these, like the CRL and whatever else, these serious infrastructure projects that I think Auckland actually has enough of a critical mass now to kind of longitude, how do you call it? Like you can fund that across 30 years in the sense of funding that efficiently. So I'm looking forward to that. I can only speak from that point of view that from cities that has evolved far into the populations, they have done exactly what you said. But they're still struggling right now. So maybe we can come up with something better.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one last question for the panel members. Considering we have only 9 years until 2030, and we should reduce our carbon emissions by 45% to avoid running climate change after that year, 2030. So we are really in a difficult situation, and we have all these issues around the world at the moment with floods and wildfires and what have you. So considering that, and that our emissions up to date, especially transport, have only been on the rise, despite all the different targets that we have set here as a nation or as a city or so. As panel members, what is the one thing you would kick off tomorrow to finally reduce emissions? What is the one big thing you would start? Not personally, but what you would like to see initiated. Ross. Come to the front of the class.
I might divert that question to something a little bit different, in that I don't feel that the community in Auckland is ready for this. And I think the first thing we have to do is to make it clear to everyone we're in an emergency situation, we have to do something, and everyone has in part to play in this. And once you get that attitude through, once the people believe in that, we'll start finding real change more quickly. At present, you're telling people this is what you got to do, you got to do this, that, but not explaining clearly why, not getting commitment from the community. And my view anyway, that has to come first. Leave it at that.
Thanks for that answer. That might actually dovetail quite well into what Helen might want to say to us. Can't unmute you. Can you unmute yourself?
Thank you. You have now. No, I couldn't. I was trying to do that, but I'm unmuted now, so it's all good. I think I agree with Ross in some aspects. I mean, I think the culture of what we're doing is really important, and I do think we need to have a substantial discussion about how we shift culture. I'm not entirely convinced that education is the way, because as I said at the beginning, when we tell people what they should do, there is often resistance to that, and I think that is probably partly where some of the resistance to the fee-based scheme is coming from, that people feel they are being told to change. So I think we have to tread very carefully when we're talking about trying to change culture. It's not as simple, I would say, as educating people, but I do agree with Ross that it is absolutely where we should start. And I do think it is entirely possible to change culture and to change the way that people think about things. I think if you look at the advertising budget of the global car industry and consider that that's what we're up against, it gives you some idea of the challenge that we're facing. So I think I'm sorry to the people who would rather not see a lot more money spent on this, but I think that is a reality of where we have to go. And really, if our environment is worth it, we will do it.
Thank you, Helen. Any more here?
One thing I will change from tomorrow, if I could, is definitely affordability of public transport. We live in New Zealand for about 17 years. I don't have a car in 17 years, but it required a lot of commitment. We have only one car in a family, and it is hard to do when you only have one car, and I try not to use it. I try to use public transport. And I totally understand that in relation to cost you were talking about, but how expensive it can be. So you really need to have a very strong drive to go on that path against the economics of your family, but for your beliefs. So one thing I will change, if I could, is affordability.
Mm-hmm. You want to have the last word before I do it?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. And other than saying on all fronts, we need to change. I do think that it's very, very important that we have very strong leadership, and that is critical. And that leadership needs to be not at the surface level, but deep to understanding what the problems are. So the first thing that I would do is that we need to fully account for our carbon emissions, and we don't. We don't consider what effect we're actually having in New Zealand and in a city, in a region, because we've got all these other factors that we don't even measure. So measuring and evaluating things is really important, and that's some things that the university sector can actually help with in terms of setting up programs or understanding how change can actually be positive. And I think that's part of the marketing, part of the discussion that we need to have with the public, is that we need to demonstrate why change needs to happen, but also that there is mechanisms and things that each one of us can do that can make positive change too. Now, I agree with Helen that it's very easy. We've been trying to get the public to be, and ourselves to be, more shared for years. And then we had COVID last year, which did absolutely the opposite, right? Basically said, for public transport, don't share because there's a pandemic that's actually occurring. So I think we're not very good at, as Helen mentions, at shifting what Helen calls culture. I don't like using the culture because I think culture is a different thing to some degree. And I think we do have to look at other alternative ways of living other than the Western way of living. And I think Te Ao Māori communities and the way they live and work together around the marae, for example, they pitch in and help. They have shared mobility. They pick up where the slack is. When there's the pandemic example, the way maraes acted around the country in terms of being able to feed their community when they all lost their jobs, there's fantastic ways that we can learn that we need to be better at the way we think we can do as well. So we all need to change. We all need to share better. We all need to understand what it means to live more locally in the communities that we live and actually care for each other to be able to do those aspects, because then we're going to want to go to our cafe down the road rather than travel 5 kilometres down the road in a car to actually do that, because we want to interact with those people. They're part of our lives. And that's where walking, cycling, having those communities. And that was one good thing about COVID that we learned, is actually, there was a whole lot of people living around us that were going through the same thing that we could start to talk to and address. And so I think it does take a multi-factor approach, but there are things that we can do. And living more locally, working more locally, recreationally and socially interacting more locally has to be part of the solution, because that reduces VKT. It shifts it to more opportunities that are cycle or micromobility and other devices. And so we are reducing that footprint all the time by living more locally. And that includes the materials that we use. So the more we can use materials, recycle them and reuse them in the environments that we have, the less the footprint is going to be, rather than transporting them long distances.
Thank you very much. Yeah, in conclusion, I'd like to thank our panel members here for the expertise and wisdom they have shared with us and patiently answered our questions here, including Helen in Christchurch. And I'd like to thank our sponsor again to not deliver CO2, but carbon, what is it? Carbon hydro, whatever. Pizzas, yeah. Carbohydrates. That's the word I was looking for. I'm a mechanical engineer, not a chemist. But yeah, and we want to make this session here available on the. We recorded it, and it will be on the ESR website. I like to apologize on for the people out there on Zoom. We could not react to your chat contributions, but what we can do is put a sanitized version of your comments on the web as well, because there are a number of very good comments that came up here, and unfortunately we couldn't quite react to them. But thanks for doing that, and thanks to everyone for coming here and making this a good evening event. You can talk amongst yourselves now.
Just a last comment, we will make the recording available on the Engineers for Social Responsibility website. So it has been recorded. So if you're interested in passing it on to others as well, please do so.